From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper. Joining me today is Matt Martens. Matt is a regular guest here on The Bulletin. He's a lawyer based in D.C. He served in the George W. Bush administration and was also the author, most recently, of a book called Reforming Criminal Justice. Matt, welcome back to The Bulletin.
Thanks for having me back, Mike.
So, Matt, I wanted to have you on because there was an indictment that was announced this week by the Department of Justice related to an inquiry that they are conducting into the Southern Baptist Convention, allegations of sexual abuse and cover-up inside the SBC. This is something that's been an ongoing story for quite a while. Before we dig into that, let me just give our listeners kind of a quick rundown of what's been happening. A lot of people will be familiar with this conversation because it sort of erupted in public around the time of the Me Too, 2017. There was this surge of conversations around Me Too. There was a surge of conversations around Church Too as well, sexual abuse in the church. But actually, this story goes back 20 plus years of conversations in the SBC, really around the time when there was a lot of pre-scandals around the 2000s. 2002, the SBC passes a resolution, largely symbolic, essentially saying, we don't think pastors should be allowed to conduct sexual abuse. 2004, there was an attempt to form a committee, essentially a committee of inquiry to just look into how are we handling these things. That effort failed, and around the time of that effort, however, a survivor named Krista Brown came forward and shared her story. And Krista has been one of the foremost activists on this issue for 20 years now. There were several other initiatives around these issues around that time. 2006, there was another one that also failed. And then the issue sort of dies down. 2017, Church 2 happens. One of the major milestones was a lawsuit announced against Paul Pressler, one of the architects of the SBC's conservative resurgence in the 1980s. I imagine we might talk about that a little bit here. He was accused of sexual abuse against young men. 2018, Paige Patterson was removed from leadership from Southwestern Seminary over allegations of covering up sexual abuse. Frank Page, an SBC executive, resigned, and shortly after his resignation, it was announced that it was due to an inappropriate sexual relationship. 2019, Houston Chronicle publishes the story. This was probably the big bombshell in all of this, where they published a story chronicling dozens of cases over 20 years of sexual abuse. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission hosts a conference called Caring Well, that was all about sexual abuse. And again, you just have the temperature on these issues rising and rising. 2021, the convention gathers and passes a resolution, overwhelmingly approves a resolution to form a committee to look into sexual abuse and cover up inside the church. 2022, that report is published. It's a damning report. One of the names mentioned in the report are actually, it contains allegations against another SBC former president, Johnny Hunt, who resigns from ministry at that time as well. And also during that year, the SBC announced that they had reached a settlement with another survivor, a woman named Jennifer Lyell, who had worked at several SBC entities. Throughout all of this, you've had these various factions. You've had people who've said, look, the corruption runs all the way through it. We need to burn the whole thing down. You've had other people saying this is all smoke and mirrors. This is all exaggerated. We need to roll back the clock. Sort of a make the SBC great again faction. And then I think you also have a lot of, maybe we can call them SBC normies, who are people sitting in the pews saying, clearly something is wrong. We want to see healthy reforms. We don't want to overreact, but we don't quite know what to think. On top of all of this, last year, this announcement comes out that the Department of Justice is investigating the SBC, looking into this history, and now we have this indictment. Matt, let me put it to you this way. I'd love to just hear your take on the SBC as a whole. Am I seeing that right? Do you think that accurately reflects the state of affairs? And then I'd love to hear what you saw as you read this indictment.
Well, a lot of what you described there predates my time with the SBC, meaning in an SBC church. I've only been a member of an SBC church since 2014, and so I've been somewhat familiar with the events that you recounted there since that time. But a lot of that, as you point out, goes back 10 years before I was even a member of an SBC church. But as you pointed out, the indictment this week takes the issue to a new level, at least a new level of prominence, by now setting up a federal criminal trial over at least how certain members of one particular seminary handled the response to a subpoena that was issued by the U.S. Attorney's Office in connection with that investigation.
What exactly is in the indictment? What does it allege?
So the indictment alleges a single count of one particular obstruction of justice statute, a statute that was actually enacted in reaction to the Arthur Anderson issue in back in, if you remember Enron and Arthur Anderson back in, I guess that was 2001, now 23 years ago. There was a question about whether or not Arthur Anderson had destroyed documents that were relevant to an investigation, and ultimately the conviction of Arthur Anderson, the accounting firm, was overturned because the Supreme Court concluded that the statute at issue that Arthur Anderson was charged with violating didn't actually apply to the particular conduct. So the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that came after Enron added a new statute called 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, which applies to destroying, altering, or falsifying documents in anticipation of an investigation, even if an investigation isn't yet underway. It's an interesting choice of a statute to use for reasons I can get into, because an investigation was underway. But what's also interesting is that the charging document against Matthew Queen, a pastor in North Carolina who was previously a member of the staff at the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, recounts some facts that were previously unknown, at least publicly unknown, before the charging document, the criminal charges, were unveiled earlier this week. So in short, there's an allegation that a grand jury subpoena was served on Southwestern Seminary in October of 2022, and in November of 2022, after receiving the subpoena, the seminary received a report of a sexual assault committed by a student, which was reported to campus police, but apparently no further action was taken on that allegation. And as a result, an employee at the Southwestern Seminary prepared a memo of some sort, a document of some sort, in January of 2023 recounting this history of events. And the indictment alleges that the next day there was a meeting between three people, a senior executive of the seminary, the employee who created the memo, and Matthew Queen, in which the executive allegedly said to something to the effect of, make that document go away. And then what occurred after that is the subject of the indictment of Mr. Queen, which is what happened when he was asked about those events in interviews by the U.S. Attorney's Office. There's an allegation that he was initially interviewed in May of 2023 about these events, and the allegation is that he falsely stated he had not heard the senior executive at the seminary say to make that document go away. And then subsequently, a few days later, he brought forward what he purportedly represented were some notes of that meeting. And the allegation is that those notes were created after the initial interview that he had with the U.S. Attorney's Office, but were represented, at least initially, to be contemporaneous notes of the meeting that had occurred. And so the dispute, it appears, between Mr. Queen and the government now that will be settled in a criminal case is when were those notes created? And B, what did he represent to the government about when those notes were created?
Has he said anything publicly to this point to dispute their charge or to comment on it one way or another?
Well, he has released a statement yesterday in which he denies any wrongdoing and said he intends to defend his reputation. And so that's what criminal trials are for. The government says that he did certain things, and he says he didn't. And the good thing about this country is he'll get a trial, I believe a fair trial, in which he'll have an opportunity to present his defense on whether or not he did, in fact, engage in conduct that was misleading to the government.
I read the case this week, and I was like, for survivors who have felt gaslit, and particularly for survivors who have said, it feels like we're not being engaged in good faith here, right? If these allegations are true, then what the allegations seem to indicate is that the survivors have been right, all along, essentially, that there was, first of all, you have a story here of a sexual assault on campus not reported to the police. And this is not before these issues hit conscious. This is not 10 years ago. This is not pre-Church Too, pre-Me Too, or anything like that. Like, this is well into the discussion of how should we handle these things. So a sexual assault is not reported to the police, and you have a Baptist executive saying, literally, essentially cover that thing up, So it has to feel vindicating, I imagine, for some survivors. I mean, am I reading that, again, understanding that it's all allegation at this point? If the allegations are true, am I reading the story correctly here?
Well, here's what I would say. What the bombshell allegation in this criminal charge is that ultimately Mr. Queen testified before the grand jury, according to the charging document, that there was in fact a meeting in which a senior executive said, make that document go away, which is a pretty remarkable allegation, that after a criminal investigation is ongoing into whether or not executives at the Southern Baptist, at this particular seminary, were correctly handling allegations of sexual assault, when someone wrote a memo saying this didn't got reported and then no one did anything, the response was, make that document disappear. That's if that actually happened, which the charging document says Mr. Queen ultimately acknowledged happened, that's a remarkable meeting, to say the least, that even after the criminal investigation begins, someone saying, get rid of a memo that says we didn't do anything in response to an allegation of sexual abuse.
Yeah. Do you think with an indictment like this, do you think this is I guess I put it this way, do you think this is the end of the story or the beginning of the story with this DOJ investigation? Like, do you imagine are there any indications that there's more to come from what they've been looking at?
Well, it's interesting. I read the docket, and there's two different charging documents in the docket that have now been unsealed. One was originally an indictment returned on May 8th, 2024 under seal, and it has now been unsealed, and it contains numerous redactions. There's a subsequent charging document dated earlier this week called a bill of information, which is another way a federal criminal charge can be brought. And it doesn't have the redactions. But if you compare the two documents, the redactions are where it appears certain other people's names were actually listed, where the new bill of information replaces the names with employee number 1, employee number 2. And there's a DOJ policy that says you cannot name other people in a charging document if those other people haven't been charged themselves. So that raises a very interesting question of why did they include names, apparently, in the original indictment? Is it because someone else was charged and we just don't know about it yet? Or is it just because there was more description that would give away who that person was? But for whatever reason, it appears there was either more description or actual names included in the original charging document. So I would suspect that we haven't heard the last of this.
How do how do you imagine this is going to affect? Do you have any sense of how this might affect the convention as a whole, and this broader conversation about how the church is handling abuse and where we take things from here?
Well, I assume that different folks will have different takes on it. I assume some people will view this as vindication of what they've been saying about mishandling of allegations of abuse. They'll point to the allegations in the charging document that say a complaint was made, it was reported to police and then campus police, and then nothing more came of it. And other folks will say this is a one-off instance and it's involving one institution. There's no evidence that it's occurring at a broader level. So I assume that people who have different perspectives on how on the events of the last 20 years, as you pointed out, will probably have different perspectives on this particular charging document as well.
Do you have a take on it? I'm curious what you think.
Well, I take it as an allegation, so I don't know whether it's true or not true at this point. That's what we'll have a trial about. But if the indictment is properly recounting that Mr. Queen acknowledged ultimately that there was a meeting where this direction was given to make this document go away, and if in fact what he recounted is true, meaning that meeting did occur, that's a serious event. That there would be a culture where two people at in a meeting of three people, a senior executive would feel comfortable saying, make a document disappear while a federal criminal investigation is going on. That's a real problem if something like that occurred.
Yeah. Last question, because I think you said something early on in the conversation here that I think is important for our listeners to think about. One of the drum beats we regularly return to here on the Bulletin, probably part of what I think Daniel Silliman called it Bulletin bingo, because certain things we always come back to. One of them is like the crumbling of faith in our institutions, and the Department of Justice is one of those institutions where people on both sides of the aisle have reasons to criticize, cultivate conspiracy theories, whatever it may be. I mean, just this week you had the crazy interpretations from some on the right about the search warrants at Mar-a-Lago, and then you have there's a mirror image of it on the left as well. You said something though that I think is important, and you wrote a book about reforming criminal justice. You have your critiques of our criminal justice system. But I think at least once, I think maybe twice in this conversation, you've said there'll be a trial, it'll be a fair trial, and we'll find out. Why do you have confidence that something like this can be adjudicated fairly in our system?
Well, I'll make a couple points there. If one reads my book and sees my critique of the criminal justice system, I think most of the critiques relate to the way that the criminal justice system is operated at the state level in the United States, which is, I think, where most of the problems reside. I think that the federal criminal justice system is much more competent and effective. And this district in particular, where this crime is charged, the Southern District of New York, I think is probably one of the most high-functioning crown jewels of the criminal justice system, both in terms of the quality of the judges and the quality of the lawyering. So I have a high degree of confidence in the ability to get a fair trial in front of that court. I would say that one of the really interesting things about this case, and this goes back to this also relates to your point about confidence in institutions, is that the crime that he's charged with requires that Mr. Queen engaged in misconduct in a investigation that was within the jurisdiction of the United States to investigate. And what we don't know at this point is what is the federal government investigating about all of this that is within their jurisdiction. In other words, even if one believes that there was some cover-up at the institutional level of the SBC of sexual abuse allegations, it's not at all clear to me either that creates any issue of within the federal government's jurisdiction, which is much more limited than the jurisdiction that states have to investigate crime. And there's also a question under the Constitution about the ability of any government to regulate the a religious organization's supervision of its ministers. The Supreme Court has said that the governance of a religious organization is outside the jurisdiction of state or federal governments. So I think that there could be some really interesting discussion and, in fact, litigation over what the federal government's jurisdiction was here. And I think that goes to your point about confidence in institutions, because I think a lot of people are concerned about what's the basis for the federal government to be injecting itself into this. Is there a legitimate basis to it, or is it political, as some have claimed? And I think that this indictment could ultimately air at least the government's theory about what jurisdiction they have to investigate this matter.
Yeah. It is interesting that we really don't know what's being investigated. I've heard a couple different commentators say that about this. I suppose
it's not obvious to me what that is that they're investigating, what the federal crime is that they could be investigating. And I assume Mr. Queen, as a competent lawyer, that they'll put this issue at least in front of the court as to whether or not there was any legitimate federal investigation going on here. I assume the government has a theory, but it hasn't been aired to date. I expect we're going to hear about it soon.
Well, Matt Martens, thanks for helping us understand it and for joining us for this conversation today.
Thanks again for having me, Mike.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.